The Council seized our war codes. We hadn't needed them in years. The most recent package in the manifest was 31 years old. Dara Soonvel sorted the query a second time, because that was not a number that should have been there. She had learned over 22 years of analysis that when a number should not be there, it usually meant someone had decided you did not need to know what it was telling you. Her query tablet hummed against her left forearm. 3:47 station time. The analyst quarters were dark except for the running lights cycling past the viewport, green, amber, red, dark, every 7 seconds, the pace of the station's night rotation. Outside, Ethai's station held its breath. Inside, the convocation tier was sealed behind 14 pressure doors, and a silence that had been sitting wrong in her chest since the vote. 14,400 encryption packages. She pulled the sort a third time. Every timestamp fell between 28 and 36 years old. The most recent, 31, the oldest, 36, all decommissioned, all inert, not maintained, not cycled, not touched. The Council had announced, 6 hours ago, that it had secured humanity's military architecture. It had secured humanity's museum. Soonvel sat back in her narrow chair. The viewport framed nothing but station running lights and the slow rotation of something vast beyond them. The Sorvith anchorage ring, 50,000 kilometers out, where 81 Vethori weapons installations sat in declared orderliness, every registry updated to the hour. She thought about the armament accountability protocol. She thought about Reth Vaughn straightening the session document with 2 fingers before the vote, the way a craftsman smooths the last seam of a finished thing. He had not looked at the human delegation. He had not needed to. The tab on her tablet marked KANDHRI trade variants flashed. Her actual assignment. She ignored it. She was not supposed to be awake. She was not supposed to have access to the seizure manifest. The query she had run would flag in her senior coordinator's morning review, and she was already constructing the explanation. Routine audit crosscheck, trade lane variants intersect, minor discrepancy noticed, preliminary pull requested, and none of it was true. She had pulled the manifest because something in her chest had been sitting wrong since Vaughn straightened that document, and 22 years of being a counselor analyst meant she knew the difference between wrongness that was philosophical and wrongness that was a number. This was a number. She ran the sort again, slower this time, watching the timestamps populate one by one. 36 years, 34, 32, 31, nothing newer than 31. The seizure had occurred at 9:14 station time, 11 minutes. 14,400 packages, overwritten by Council authority under Article 7, and every single one of them had not been updated in a human generation. Soonvel held the tablet still. The running lights moved past the viewport. Green, amber, red, 72 hours at most, she thought. I already know. She composed a message on the tablet. One line, no classification header, no formal routing. She sent it sealed to Director Marin Solis, humanities delegate to the convocation tier, and hit transmit at 6:11. The response came in 7 seconds. You're seeing it correctly, counselor analyst. The Council took our history. They left our capability untouched. Soonvel read the line 3 times. The station lights cycled. Red to dark, dark to green. She thought 72 hours. She thought, I need to understand what I'm seeing. And then she thought something else entirely, which was, I already do. She filed the sealed message under a provisional audit code and began pulling threads. She pulled the thread, declassified human budget filings first, the ones available to any Tier 3 analyst with security routing. The Office of Strategic Dormancy appeared in exactly 1 line, buried in a subsection of the Species Continuity Reserve Mechanism Appropriations, filed as a non-military body. She cross-referenced the founding date, 29 years ago, 2 months after the last decommissioning order on the legacy arsenal had been signed. Fleet disposition records came next. The declared human fleet occupied 14 lines in the Council registry, legacy ships, all mothballed, all accounted for in the seizure manifest. Every one of them timestamped between 28 and 36 years old. She stared at the screen. The running lights moved past the viewport. She opened the Reach Station Kemvar trade manifests. Reach Station was humanity's declared Class IV industrial complex, medium output, civilian infrastructure components, nothing that triggered oversight. The manifests had been filed quarterly with the Council for 14 years without a single variance notice. She pulled the first one at random. 2847 station units of processed duralium, 1,140 reactor core casings, 8,300 standard communications arrays, 642 unclassified fabrication units. She sorted by category. The unclassified units appeared in every single manifest, 14 years of them, always between 600 and 900 per quarter, their specifications redacted under Human Sovereignty Clause 4b. The same gap, the same clean, deliberate absence. A military architecture that should have updated in the registry had instead updated in plain sight, hidden inside trade manifests no one was reading carefully enough to see. Soonvel ran the query 4 ways. The gap did not close. At 4:47, she pulled the founding charter of the Office of Strategic Dormancy from a file marked sealed indefinite. The document was 47 pages of species continuity legal architecture. It took her 40 minutes to read the 46 pages that explained what the office was: a reserve mechanism, a contingency structure, a framework for species persistence in the event of systemic failure. Then she reached the sentence that did the work of all 46 other pages. We decommissioned the legacy arsenal because we were afraid of what we had been. We built something quieter afterward because we were honest about what we might still become. She read it 4 times in succession. The station lights cycled, red to dark, amber to red. The Sorveth anchorage ring rotated beyond the viewport, its 81 installations declared, catalogued, and currently sitting in the state they had occupied for 43 days, since before the protocol vote, since before the chamber had even convened to discuss the seizure. She thought, the Council did not seize humanity's capability. They seized humanity's grief. Her tablet chimed. A second message from Solly's, timestamp 4:51, 4 minutes after Soonvel had pulled the founding charter. Not words, just coordinates and a single number, 9,400. Soonvel sat without moving. She knew what 9,400 meant. She had spent the last 2 hours learning what it meant. 9,400 vessels, not in the registry, not declared, not updated, assembled across 14 years in the space between what humanity had decided to grieve publicly and what humanity had quietly kept, not from aggression, but from the same honest reckoning that had produced that sentence about what they might still become. She opened the sealed message again and read the coordinates. Reach Station Kemvar, the industrial complex, the trade manifests, the unclassified fabrication units. The capability was already moving. It had departed 4 hours after the seizure, not in response to a decision, in execution of a contingency that was already prepared. Soonvel filed a provisional analysis note at 5:03. Possible undeclared strategic reserve, scale unconfirmed, apparent activation window 4 hours post-protocol seizure, source, inference from gap analysis. She filed it sealed, to her senior coordinator and to no one else. Then she did something she had not done in 22 years of analysis. She filed a second note, 3 sentences, marked for her eyes only. The Council's protocol was used to remove a threat that did not exist. The actual capability has been in motion for approximately 68 hours. I do not know whether what is happening now was the only possible response, or whether it was the response that was always prepared regardless of what the Council decided to do. She closed the tablet and sat in the dark. Across Ethai's station, in the human delegation quarters, Director Marin Solis was not asleep either. She sat at a narrow desk, her hands flat on the surface, and watched the evacuation notices transmit automatically to every Vethori civilian worker across 11 systems. Coordinated, calm, carrying coordinates, transit assistance, medical support, and a 68-hour deadline. The notices had been drafted 43 days ago. They had been waiting in a sealed queue, tied to a condition code that activated the moment the Office of Strategic Dormancy received authorization to move. Solis had not written the condition code. She had simply chosen not to override it when the moment came. She watched the transmission logs populate. 5,200 notifications sent, 8,300, 12,600. The evacuation was happening at civilian transit pace. Not panicked, not announced, just a slow, steady tide of people moving away from the 11 systems where the task forces were beginning their approach vectors. She thought about the session document on Vaughn's podium. She thought about his 2 fingers straightening it before the vote. She thought about what it meant that he had not looked at the human delegation, and what it meant that she had not looked at him, because if she had, he would have known that she was not watching weather. She was watching someone about to learn that the only species he had ever read as weak had been measuring its own capability by a different scale entirely. Solis did not turn off the recording still playing at Reach Station Kemvar, a child's birthday, someone's child, blowing out candles in front of a window full of stars, the audio file set to loop until someone chose to stop it. She let it play. She watched the evacuation notices transmit. She thought about whether the galaxy would ever understand the difference between silence and absence, and whether that difference would matter once the task forces began their work. The gap between what was declared and what was built had taken 14 years. The reckoning would take less than 4. The first position report arrived at 6:14 on the second day. Soonvel was still in her analyst quarters. She had not left. She had not slept. She had pulled every thread she could access without triggering a Tier 7 clearance alert. And now, she was watching the outer transit corridors of the 11 flagged systems for drive signature anomalies that would confirm what Solis had already put in motion. The anomaly came through as a relay buoy dropout on the standard monitoring feed, the kind of minor system failure that happened 17 times a day across the station networks. Soonvel saw it and knew immediately what it meant. A ship had passed close enough to overload the buoy's sensor threshold. A large ship, moving at fleet pace. The task forces were moving. She cross-referenced the buoy's timestamp against the coordinates Solis had sent. The vector matched. The approach rate matched. The task forces had been moving for exactly 68 hours. The same deadline written into the evacuation notices that were still transmitting automatically to Vethori civilian workers across all 11 systems. Soonvel filed a note. 1 sentence. The first wave is passing the outer markers. At 8:47, a second relay buoy went offline. Then a third. The pattern emerged across the monitoring feed like a tide not announced, just continuous. Each dropout marking the passage of another vessel, another vector, another ship with a task designation that had never appeared in any registry. Covenant, Lament, Meridian. The names came from human history that the Council had seized and locked away, but they belonged to something newer now, something the galaxy had never known existed. The Chamber did not know yet. The observation feeds that broadcast to the secondary galleries were still showing the standard session proceedings, trade route amendments, environmental variance petitions, the slow machinery of 214 delegations managing the minutiae of galactic commerce. Reth Vaughn sat at his podium, the session document precisely squared beneath his right hand, and conducted the morning session as though the sky outside was not beginning to fill with something humanity had kept quiet for 14 years. Soonvel pulled the evacuation manifests. 500,000 Vethori civilians had accepted transit assistance in the first 60 hours. 600,000, 700,000. The numbers climbed steadily. The transit hubs were moving people in an orderly fashion, coordinated, calm, no panic, because the evacuation notices had been explicit. 68 hours, plenty of time, here are the coordinates, here is your departure window. The Vethori were not afraid. They were simply being moved out of the way. At 1100 she filed another note. Relay buoy dropout rate suggests main wave composition of 8,300 vessels plus secondary escorts. Approach rate constant. Current ETA to first target, 41 hours. The notation sat in her provisional queue. She did not send it anywhere. She did not file it under her security clearance. She simply recorded it, the way someone might record a breath before they chose whether to speak. Her senior coordinator had transmitted 4 times, first requesting her presence at a variance briefing, then asking for a status update on her Kandahari assignments. Then, by the 4th message at 9:30, simply noting that Soonvel's location was flagged as unaccounted for and requesting confirmation that she was functioning within normal parameters. She did not respond. She had cast her lot with whatever Solis was doing, and responding to her coordinator now would only draw institutional attention to the fact that she was not where she was supposed to be, doing what she was supposed to be doing. She thought about the 9 months of committee work, the protocol debate, the weeks she had sat in the gallery and watched Vaughn build the language piece by careful piece, elegant, neutral, species agnostic. She thought about the vote, the motion to override human objection, the weight of block pressure that was not pressure at all, just the simple arithmetic of 214 delegations deciding that one species' resistance did not matter. And she thought about her own hand, raised in objection, and then lowered, and then forgotten, filed away like one of the inert encryption packages the Council had just seized. She had not told anyone. She had not sounded an alarm. She had voted against the protocol and then spent 9 months in silence. The distinction between abstaining and complicity was starting to feel less clear than it had when she was voting. Solis was in the delegation quarters, watching the same feeds that Soonvel was watching, but Solis was also watching something else, a series of sealed transmissions moving through cipher families that had never appeared in any registry. Encrypted traffic that did not exist, from operators who did not exist, to ships that had no declared designation. The traffic was calm. The traffic was precise. The traffic was executing a contingency that had been prepared for weeks, waiting for the moment when the Council decided it wanted to remove what it perceived as a threat. The Council had removed the threat. The Council had seized humanity's grief and locked it away. And now the Council was about to learn what humanity had done with the 14 years of honest reckoning that came after. Solis did not turn off the birthday recording. The child's voice, small, delighted, blowing out candles, continued to loop at Reach Station Kemvar, the transmission still marked as active, still waiting for someone to choose to stop remembering why the arsenal had been built in the first place. She had not told her delegation why she was keeping it on. She had not explained that the child in the recording had been 7 when the colony was attacked, and 9 now, and would be in the memorial registry by evening on the 3rd day if things went as planned. The recording was a kept thing, a deliberate choice to not move forward, not forget, not turn off the sound of what humanity had lost. On the 3rd day, at 9:14, exactly 72 hours after the protocol seizure, Director Marin Solis returned to the convocation tier. She walked through the same pressure doors that had sealed behind her 3 days prior. She occupied the same seat in the human gallery, lowest tier, geometry deliberately below every other delegation. Around her, 214 delegations in attendance, 6 observation feeds transmitting to secondary galleries, and Reth Vaughn at his podium on the senior block tier, the session document still squared precisely beneath his right hand. Solis waited for the session call. She waited for block chair acknowledgement. Then she stood. The chamber stilled. Not in the way a chamber stills when something is about to be announced. In the way a chamber stills when it has just realized it does not know what is about to be announced. The Armament Accountability Protocol executed at 0914 on the first day, Solis said. Her voice was level. 14,400 encryption packages, decommissioned by human choice, seized by Council authority, every package inert, every package a record of what we decided we could not trust ourselves to keep. She paused. The chamber did not move. We failed to declare a second architecture. The Office of Strategic Dormancy has been in existence for weeks. Task Forces Covenant, Lament, and Meridian have been in motion for 72 hours. At this moment, they are conducting coordinated operations across 11 Vethori systems. All military targets. No civilian infrastructure. The Vethori population in the affected systems began evacuation 68 hours ago, and completed evacuation 21 minutes ago. The observation feeds began to populate with incoming data, relay reports from the affected systems, position updates from the automated monitors, the tide of numbers beginning to arrive in real time. Installation 1, offline. Shipyard Ring 7, gone. The position reports came through like a signal reaching the chamber from somewhere it had decided not to look. The record should say what we actually are, Sally said, not what was convenient to believe. She sat down. Reth Vaughn sat very still at his podium. His right hand, which had been resting on the session document with the casual authority of someone who had straightened the last seam of a finished thing, remained motionless. He did not reach for the document. He did not speak. His silence, in that moment, was the silence of someone whose entire understanding of what weakness looked like had just been inverted. For 40 years, he had believed that noise meant power, that declaring meant controlling, that the species which spoke loudest, which announced itself most clearly, held the advantage in any negotiation. He had been measuring by the wrong scale. The chamber held its breath for 6 seconds. Soonvel counted them from the analyst gallery, her thumb pressed against the edge of her query tablet, watching the position reports populate across her secondary display. Anchorage Complex 1, drive signatures fading. Shipyard Ring 7, gone. Installation after installation going dark, not announced, not declared, just the slow tide of a capability that had been waiting 14 years to become visible. The observation feeds continued transmitting. The numbers continued arriving. And in that silence, the galaxy began to understand what it had been measuring with the wrong scale. The chamber was still moving. The observation feeds were still transmitting. The position reports continued to arrive. Installation after installation, shipyard ring after shipyard ring, the Vethori military architecture going dark in real time, a tide of numbers that did not require announcement because the numbers themselves were the announcement. Reth Vaughn did not move. His right hand remained flat on the session document. The gesture he had made before the vote, the straightening, the smoothing, the marking of a finished thing had been left incomplete. The document was no longer precisely squared beneath his palm. It had shifted, perhaps a centimeter, perhaps nothing at all. Enough that the shift meant something. Enough that the incomplete gesture became a kind of answer. He had straightened it once. He would not straighten it again. The block chair called for procedural order at 9:18, 4 minutes of silence. No delegation had moved to file a countermotion. No delegation had called for recess. The observation feeds were still live. The secondary galleries were still watching. The position reports were still populating. Installation after installation. The tide did not stop. Deputy Block Coordinator Arith sat with his hands flat on the desk and did not touch his collar. He had stopped touching his collar the day the protocol passed. Now he sat in the aftermath of everything that protocol had triggered, and his hands remained still. There was nothing to stabilize anymore. The protocol had done its work. It had been turned inside out. It had become its own opposite. At 9:22, 3 delegations filed an accountability charter motion simultaneously. None of them Vethori, none of them human. The language was distributed to all 214 delegations in the preceding hour by the Human Delegation's Administrative Office. It was Solis' language. Universal armament disclosure and audit, under the same Article 7 mechanism that had just been applied to humanity's seized archive, now applied to every member species without exception. The mechanism reversed. The tool inverted. The protocol that had been designed to be species-neutral had been used first on humanity's legacy, and now was being used to bind everyone else to the same standard. It was perfect, it was elegant. It was the kind of institutional genius that took someone like Vaughn to appreciate, and to realize, too late, that the genius was being wielded against him. Soonvel moved to the voting registry, before any senior block delegation had filed. She stood. The motion was on the display. The accountability charter, written in language that would require every species to disclose every armed asset, every military project, every contingency reserve that had ever been built in the shadow of what they had announced. The motion that would undo the protocol. The motion that would bind the Council to a level of transparency that would make Vaughn's elegant language look like a weapon that could only be used once. She entered her confirmation. The system registered it at 9:24. No explanation, no annotation, no senior coordinator sign-off required for this vote. It was a public registry, open to all Tier 3 analysts with delegation affiliation, and she was casting her vote on a motion that would reshape the Council's entire framework of disclosure. She cast it anyway. The first hand raised. The first confirmation. The first vote that said, yes, we need to know what everyone is actually building in the dark. Soon Vel thought about her 9 months of silence. She thought about not sounding the alarm. She thought about the distinction between abstaining and complicity, and whether that distinction had ever meant what she wanted it to mean. The vote was her answer to the question she had been asking herself since the seizure happened. The vote was her reckoning. The chamber did not speak. The chamber voted. The accountability charter passed in full session at 13:06, 4 hours after Solly sat down. 213 delegations in favor. 1 abstention. Reth Vaughn, who did not vote, did not speak, and did not call for procedural override. His abstention was entered into the record as a personal deliberative conflict, the term used when a councillor had authored a measure that was subsequently inverted, unmade, rendered obsolete by the very language it had been designed to execute. The protocol he had built with such care, 40 years of institutional precedent, elegant language, species-neutral application, had just been used to dismantle the entire block structure that had given it meaning. At 1800 session time, Director Marin Solis read 43 names into the Galactic Memorial Registry. She stood at the podium, not Vaughn's podium, the human delegation's simple speaking position on the lowest tier, and read without notes. The colonists killed at Reach Station Kemvar in an engagement 11 years prior, the event that had precipitated the founding of the Office of Strategic Dormancy, the honest reckoning with what humanity had feared it might become. She read the names slowly, each one given weight, each one a person and not a number and not a statistic and not a casualty count that could be filed away and forgotten. Solis read at a speed that suggested she had read the names many times before, in private, in the dark, in the quarters where she had watched a child's birthday recording loop for 72 hours without turning it off. She knew these names the way people know the names of things that have shaped them. She knew them the way people know the weight of decisions they have made. When she finished, at 1847, she did not sit down immediately. She stood at the podium and held the list in her hands for 4 seconds, long enough for the chamber to see that she was holding something, long enough for the weight to be visible. Then she placed the list on the podium, squared it beneath her hand, the way Vaughn had squared the session document before the protocol vote, and sat down. The chamber was quiet for 9 seconds. Soon Vel filed her analysis report at midnight. 2 paragraphs. The first, the institutional mechanics of the seized archive, the discovery of the gap, the inference protocol that had led to the office's identification. The second, a series of observations about silence and absence, about the difference between choosing not to announce and choosing not to have, about the moment when a species decides it cannot trust itself and builds something quieter anyway. But there was a third paragraph, something she added at 31 before filing, a paragraph about complicity, about 9 months of not speaking, about the vote she had cast at 9:24, about the distinction between abstaining and acting, and whether that distinction had ever been anything but a story she told herself to feel less guilty. The summary field contained 1 sentence. The species did not fear the galaxy. They feared themselves. The question the record has never answered is whether the distinction matters to everyone else in it. She filed it sealed to the accountability body's intake registry and to no one else. The third paragraph would stay in her private analysis. The public record would contain only what was necessary. The record did not need to know about her complicity. The record would know about the truth. That was enough. Reth Vaughn submitted a procedural recusal notification 6 days after the session. Personal deliberative conflict, the formal mechanism. He did not resign his council seat. He did not address the chamber again that cycle. He simply removed himself from the proceedings with the precision of someone who understood that there was nothing left in his reading of what had just happened that tidying could fix. He had spent 40 years learning to straighten things, to smooth things, to make institutional processes elegant and clear. And then, in 4 hours, he had learned what it meant when someone took your elegance and used it against you. He had learned what it meant to be measured by a scale you did not understand. He had learned, finally, what silence actually meant. The session document was removed from the convocation tier at 203 days after the vote. The nightly maintenance crew filed it in the session archive under the protocol's reference number. It was marginally off-center. Nobody had touched it in the interim. Nobody had straightened it. The gesture that had marked a finished thing had been left undone, and the unfinished gesture became a kind of answer in itself, a record of the moment when Vaughn's certainty had fractured. Soonvel passed through the chamber on her way to the transit ring the evening after the vote. The podium was empty now. The session was closed. The overhead panels had cycled to evening illumination, and there, on the edge of Vaughn's workspace, the session document sat, still there, marginally off-center. She stood at the far end of the chamber and looked at it for a long time. She thought about what it meant that he had not straightened it, that the gesture he had used to mark completion had been left incomplete. She thought it probably meant the same thing the position reports had meant, that there was nothing left in his understanding of what had happened that tidying could fix. She thought about the moment before the protocol vote, when Vaughn had straightened the document with 2 fingers, the way a craftsman smooths the last seam of a finished thing. She thought about how that gesture had felt like the ending of something, and now the ending had become an absence. The document was still there, but the certainty that had been in those 2 fingers was gone. She filed a secondary analysis at 300. 1 sentence. The institutional inversion is complete. The question that remains unanswered is whether the galaxy is actually safer, or simply more aware of what it cannot control. She did not send it anywhere. She filed it in her private work queue, the way Soonvel had filed things for 22 years, quietly, without announcement, recording what she saw and trusting that the pattern would become visible to someone else eventually. At Reach Station Kemvar, the birthday recording continued to loop. Someone's child in front of a window full of stars blowing out candles. The audio file still active, the transmission still marked as live. Director Marin Salis had not turned it off. She sat in her quarters, listening to the child's voice, listening to the sound of delight, listening to the echo of a life that had been interrupted and then avenged, not through conquest but through truth. She said she would turn it off when she was ready to stop remembering why the arsenal existed in the first place. She had not turned it off yet. She sat and listened, and outside her window, the position reports continued to populate. Installation after installation, going dark, the task forces holding their positions, the 11 systems now empty of Vethori civilians, now occupied by human forces that had never been declared and never would be. The accountability body held its first meeting at session day 302. The charter had been filed, the language had been adopted, the mechanism for universal disclosure had been put in place, and what humanity actually was, not what had been convenient to believe, but what they actually were, was now on the record. What humanity had kept was not on the record. The Office of Strategic Dormancy did not file a declaration. Task Forces Covenant, Lament, and Meridian remained in their holding patterns across the outer reaches of the designated systems. Their existence was known. Their capability was known. Their orders were not known. The contingency that had been prepared for weeks, activated for 72 hours, was now on hold, waiting for the next decision, the next moment when the galaxy miscalculated what humanity actually was. The question of what they were built for and what they were ordered to do, and whether the distinction between preparing for the worst and ensuring the worst could happen was any distinction at all, that question was still on its way to becoming a question. The accountability body would eventually ask. The galaxy would eventually demand answers. But not yet, not while the recording was still playing. The galaxy had spent 60 years deciding humans were safe. It had been measuring the wrong thing.